About hermeneutics. Most of us are getting ready to just yawn. We'll have our eyes roll back in our head and just kind of fall asleep. Hermeneutics, in case you're wondering what that is, hermeneutics is the art/science of interpretation. So it's how you read and interpret things. I'm going to shut my phone off if you don't mind. I usually shut it off in service. Hermeneutics is the art and the science of interpreting texts or reading text. How do you read and interpret what's happening in a text? Once again, people are going to think this is incredibly not very fascinating. I think it is fascinating, and hopefully we'll get into it. This is one of the key fundamentals of postmodernism, is understanding language and the role that it plays in our world. So while many of us may think of it as incredibly boring, it's actually really fundamental to getting an understanding of what postmodernism is. The scripture today is found in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. So while you're turning there, Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31, let me make sure we kind of get all caught up where we're at. In Genesis, you get God creates the world, and then man falls, and then God selects Abraham as his chosen servant, and he reveals himself to Abraham. Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has 12 tribes. Becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel becomes a nation, they leave Egypt, and they are given the promised land. God gives them the promised land of Canaan. Through a series of very high troughs and valleys, Israel essentially fails to be God's people, and they go into exile in Babylon, and the northern kingdom is destroyed, and they go into Assyria. They come back from exile, and then they have the post-exilic literature, which is Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, things of that nature. Not Job. Job actually may have happened before. And then you have the intertestamental period, which is after Malachi. So then you get Jesus, and Jesus comes to the Jews, and he brings God's word, and he brings the new covenant to them. And then he dies on the cross, is resurrected, and the apostles spread the word. And Paul is a key convert. Paul writes a series of letters to churches. Galatia is an area in what's now modern-day Turkey. So he's writing to these believers about Jesus. All right? So how's that for a summary of the Bible to Galatians in, what was it, about 35, 40 seconds, right? Not bad. Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born in the ordinary way, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a promise. These things are to be taken figuratively, for the woman represents two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves, and this is Hagar. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, be glad, O barren woman who bears no children. Break forth and cry aloud, you who have no labor pains. Because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who is a husband. Now your brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, the son, born in the ordinary way, persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. But what does the scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. Now, what's interesting about this is actually Paul, in Galatians, is actually doing hermeneutics on Genesis. There's a story in Genesis where about the story of Hagar and Abraham. We don't have time to go into it a whole lot. But Paul is doing hermeneutics on that ancient Old Testament story. He's interpreting it. He's telling the people of Galatia how to interpret it. So we're going to use this story today to kind of work through how pre-modern, modern, and postmodern would have looked at what Paul does in this section in Galatians. Does that make sense? How people throughout time have looked at what Paul did. We're not necessarily looking at Hagar and Sarah, we're looking at Paul. So over this time we've talked about pre-modern, right? We've talked about modern, and we've talked about postmodern, right? Now we're kind of using this paradigm to help us understand what we're talking about with all these things. So what would the pre-modern view of Paul's work in Galatians chapter 4 have been? Well, the pre-modern view believed, if you remember, there's a continuity, there's a sameness between people in the past and their lives now. They believe that the categories in their world make sense for the categories in Paul's world. So in other words, they use their own culture, their own time, their own language to interpret the past. So they would have looked at, pre-modern people would have looked at Paul in Galatians and said, well, he's practicing an allegorical read. They knew what allegory was, and they knew how to interpret allegory. They would say, Paul's practicing an allegorical reading. Paul is inspired by God. So God is not, it's not just Paul talking to us, God is talking to us. And he's coming at us through this text. So Paul's hermeneutic is appropriate because Paul's an apostle, and he has a right to do this. Does this make sense? That's a kind of a pre-modern approach. They would have said, when we read Sarah, we might not have thought of that, but Paul was an inspired author. He was inspired by God, so Paul does it, so it's okay because he's an apostle. That's kind of a key element here. Paul can do this because he's an apostle. So we talked about this before, right? In terms of how they viewed the world. It was kind of a web. It was kind of, you called on different authorities. Paul as an apostle has an authority to translate this text. The interesting part comes in when we talk about the modern shift. Because what are some of the things that happened when we shifted from pre-modern to modernism? Do we remember? What are some of the things that they did? About knowing and how we understand the world. Sorry, logic and reason. And the modernists did not think of themselves in continuity with the past. They kind of recognized. They could say, oh, well, people believed those kind of things then. We don't believe these kind of things now. I'll give you a great illustration. The story in, I think it's 2 Kings, where Elijah has the axe head float. The axe head floats to the surface. Pre-modern people would say, oh, well, they saw the axe head float to the surface. These kind of things can happen. These kind of things can happen in my world. They happened in their world. They can happen in my world. In a modernist perspective, the modernist perspective said, these things can't happen. We know they can't happen. All us white, northern, wealthy Europeans all talk to each other, and we all know that it can't happen. I'm doing this in jest, but actually it's not. It really is what they thought. David Hume's argument against miracles told them that you cannot have a miracle. Miracles are impossible. We know it can't possibly happen. So if anyone ever proposed, hey, I've seen one, they would say, oh, you're just a peasant from some other country. How would you possibly know? Did one of us educated people go and see it? Well, no, they didn't see that. Oh, well, then it didn't happen. You were excited about it. You got overly worked up about it. So it couldn't have possibly happened. And what modernism does is modernism becomes self-referential. As they say, the world can only be as we conceive it. It's only possible if it's happened in our world. Now this does not just affect the Bible. Okay? This is not just a biblical problem. The shift from pre-modern to modern, this actually affects anything having to do with texts and reading about the past. What might be some other disciplines, some other things other than the Bible that we might see this shift affecting?
That's how history is viewed.
History, right? History is definitely affected by this. Why? How would it affect history?
Rewrite it, in essence, because if it didn't happen, I wasn't there, I don't know how it happened, can we rely on what other people said?
Right.
Questioning all.
Absolutely. History becomes something that we have to rewrite. We have to take it away from the ignorant, superstitious people who believe ignorant, superstitious things. We've got to take it away from them. Right? So we can't listen to what they say in the past because they're ignorant people. Where's another field that might be affected by this shift? I'm sorry? Science could be, but science is not necessarily dealing with texts. I mean, you can get some scientific dealing with text, but science, in the end, science is, I took quantity A, put it in jar B, and took quantity C and put it in there, and this is what happened. It's repeatable and demonstrable. History is not repeatable and not demonstrable. I cannot bring George Washington crossing the Delaware. I can't bring it in here and show it to you.
No, but it does impact the sciences in this way. You go from the alchemist
Okay.
to the current the next understanding of what alchemy was, which is your sciences
There's some spots up here.
that are repeatable, observable. For the alchemist, that was not the case.
Yes. You can listen to other people in the past who might be able to tell you things. That's fair. That's a fair idea.
Then you also have, in terms of textual, and it deals both with history and knowing, which is anything that is unexplainable, then you have to come up with an explanation that is logical and based within our context.
Right. So that would be part of it, what they're doing. So we have history, we have some science maybe. What are some other areas that this might affect? Yeah.
Religion.
We're affect religion definitely because of the Bible.
Just, yeah.
What else? What's a doctrine or not a doctrine? What's a discipline in our culture that deals with reading things all the time?
Literature.
Literature, right? Literature, history, religion, and literature, these are all, and some science, these are all being impacted by this modernistic shift, okay? So one of the things that they did is modernists said, if it's not possible in my world, it's not possible in anyone's world. If it can't happen in front of me, it can't have happened at all. So an example of this, non-religious, is the Pliny the Elder's description of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Who saw the movie Pompeii? You should see the movie Pompeii. It's fun because everybody dies. So that's a fun story. I don't mean to spoil it for you, but the mountain blows up and literally everybody dies. So it's a lot of fun. But the important thing about that is when Pliny the Elder described it, historians in Europe said, we've never seen an eruption like that. Those kind of eruptions don't happen. So this is how they reinterpreted Pliny the Elder. They said, oh, he was just really excited about the eruption. He was just really excited about what happened, and he just kind of wrote exaggeratedly about these kind of eruptions. We know those things don't happen. Pliny just kind of, he got excited and he overwrote it. That many people couldn't have died. It couldn't have wiped out a whole town. I mean, we can go there to Mount Vesuvius and look, and there's no towns around here. We can dig down 2 or 3 feet, and we find nothing. Right? This is how modernists... So this doesn't just affect religion, okay? This isn't a religious issue. This is a hermeneutical issue. How do you read texts? And so what modernists did is they went to all these texts and they had to reinterpret them. And they had to pull out their biases. Why would Pliny write about it like that? Well, it couldn't have been because it happened that way. It has to be what? He has an agenda. He has a game. He has an angle. He has a bias. And the historian's job is to pull out his bias and tell all of us what? Well, what really happened. That's modernism. That's the shift. And it's my job as a historian to pull out the real facts, because I have to filter out Pliny the Elder's facts, because his are kind of biased and exaggerated. I got to pull them out, and then I'm going to reconstruct history for you. And so what it is who's the only people telling us the truth about the past? Is it any of these people? No. Who's telling us the truth about the past? Well, it's the third party 1,800 years later who's giving us a description of the facts. Right? That's the only person who's really telling us the truth. All the sources, all the other people in the past, all these things, they are unreliable. So modernism has this break. And it says, we are not like the people in the past. We're objective. They were biased. We're objective. They were steeped in purpose and in description. We are just trying to find the truth. They're trying to sell you something. We're not trying to sell you anything. We're just in this for the truth. They're in it for the money. Most of us are sitting here going, I can't believe people would actually believe that, right? This is really what they thought. We can tell you the truth because we know the reality of the world. those people didn't know the reality of the world. And most of us, if we have any postmodernism in us at all, we're going to go, man, those guys sound arrogant. Right? That's what we're going to, if we have any postmodernism in it at all, we're going to go, man, that's not possible. So what would they do with Galatians chapter 4? Well, this is what they did. They would say Paul's interpretation of Galatians chapter 4 is him butchering the original meaning of Genesis, of that story in Genesis. He is making something up. Why? Because he's trying to tell the Galatians people that they don't need to be circumcised. So he's going to the past and he's reading into the past. He's pulling out meaning that isn't really there. And so that who gives the real meaning of the story of Hagar and Sarah in Genesis chapter and that Genesis story? I can't think of the chapter title. That's why I keep saying chapter. I don't remember the title, the chapter number. Is Paul giving us the meaning of that story? No. Paul is butchering the real meaning. Every text has one meaning. And it's the author's meaning. The author's meaning is the one that gives absolute meaning. So the only meaning there is what the author intended. Did the author of Genesis write it going, golly, I hope they figure out that, the one covenant represents Hagar and the other covenant represents Sarah, and that we want to be, is that what the author, if you read the story, is that what the author of Genesis is thinking? It certainly doesn't seem like that. So that would mean that Paul's interpretation of the law in Galatians chapter 4 is a butchery of the original meaning. Okay? This is the pre-modern to modern shift. Postmodernism is going to mess all of this up. So I have to clear the board because it's going to mess it all up. Do we get the shift? It's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of simple. The big shift between pre-modern and modern is modernists really understood that past is not like now. The past is its own time, and we live in our time. And the past cannot be understood in reference to our own time. In other words, when we think of words like father and mother and sister and brother, we cannot take those meanings to us and export them back to the past and think we know what the author means. We have to go to that culture and understand that culture. We have to think what father, mother, sister, brother meant to them, and then we read the text. So they were, what you might call, they were interested in historical context. Understand the time and the place. But here's where they're different from postmodernism. Postmodernism is going to blow all this up. Modernists believe you could objectively describe the past, and that they were objective and everybody else wasn't. And so they could tell you what the real story was. They were biased, bigoted people. They had something to sell. They were trying to make you Jewish. We're going to tell you what it's really like. We're going to tell you what really happened. Postmodernism says, oh really? You think you are objective? And it's going to systematically destroy the concept of our objectivity in modernism. So the postmodern shift kind of begins with the understanding of language. There's a guy by the name in the mid-20th century whose name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was Austrian. I always struggle with that name. Wittgenstein, that's a fun name, isn't it? He was Austrian, and he moved to, I think it was Sweden, I believe, one of the Norwegian countries. So he was bilingual because he grows up Austrian. He has an English family. He ends up living in Sweden. One of the things that he proposed is that people play word games or language games. That's lame. Let's try this again. Like I said, when you pick up a pen, it makes your brain stop working. Okay, so he said that people play word games or language games. Let me get at what Wittgenstein was saying. Is he said essentially this: when you and I communicate, I have a picture in my head of what I'm thinking about. For example, at this moment I'm thinking of a jellyfish eating a peanut butter jelly sandwich. That's a picture I have in my head. Now some of us can go, that's a really funny image we have in our head, right? I think of a picture and I communicate that to you with language. Wittgenstein said is, we communicate in language, but language is incredibly imprecise. My words don't describe a picture. Because sometimes we stand at the edge of a precipice and we say what? Words can't describe how beautiful it was, right? We're trying to use language to describe an image that we have in our head. So the picture in my head and the picture in your head when I say a jellyfish eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, my bet is we're thinking of different looking jellyfish. Right? We have a different image. Some of us may have the round ones, some of us have the squiddy ones with the long tentacles, some have short tentacles. Some of us are thinking of Finding Dory. Right? So the image that's in my head and the image that is in your head are different. And they're not exact. And because they're different and they're not exact, they're imprecise. And because they're imprecise, am I really understanding you? Am I really getting at what you're saying? It's in your head, it's in your thought, but you can't really get at it. He then added one more layer to it, and he said, language is this sense of, it plays games with each other. Now, let me see if I can put it so that we can understand this. My wife comes home from work, and we sit down, and she says, oh, honey, I just had this awful day. My boss has been just writing me terrible on this issue, and just making me, he wants me to do this and this and this. And I said, well, what about this and this and this? No one can relate to this, right? No one's had this happen, right? So she's talking to me, and I go, oh, honey, well, this is what you got to do. You need to go talk to this person and tell him that this is what they got to do. And then you need to talk to this person and tell them that no one else has ever done this either. Am I off here? Okay. So the husband says, this is what I think we need to do. And the wife starts getting angrier. And my wife is getting angrier and angrier. She's getting madder and madder. And she says, well, that's not what I wanted you to do. Now, I'm a guy. I go, well, you came to me asking for advice. And she said, no, I didn't. I came to you asking for your sympathy. Right? And then I go, oh, I thought we were playing the she comes to Mike and asks for advice game. You're playing the she comes to ask Mike for sympathy game. I thought we were playing one game and we're actually doing what? We're playing another. Okay? Now this idea begins to just build. Alright? This concept that you're playing one game in your head, she's playing another game in her head, and these worlds don't actually fit together very well. And when you're using pictures in your head, but words to talk, what kind of a world comes out? How many misunderstandings can happen if we think in pictures but talk in words, and there's multiple games you can play with the same language? What's going to begin to happen? What happens to our language?
Do you get misunderstandings?
What kind of misunderstandings?
Sometimes small, but sometimes just fundamentally you're talking about very different things.
You're talking, so we take this idea of language games, and you plug it into this imprecision of our language, that we're thinking one way, but we only have one way that we can talk. Wouldn't it be so much easier if I could take an image in my head and just give it to my wife? Wouldn't that be just so much easier? But instead I don't get to do telekinesis, or whatever that is. I have to actually talk to her. And communication brings imprecision, and then word games brings a layer of complexity with which we can't really understand one another. And then what happens is communication begins to break down. And that's how we get misunderstandings. Now, here's the kicker. Whose word games was right? When I'm sitting here talking to my wife, and she says, honey, let me tell you what happened today, blah, blah, blah. Who's dictating which word games ought to be played? Should we be playing the honey, you came for me to advice game? Or should we be playing honey, I'm wanting you to understand and hear me game? Who's right?
Ask my soundboard.
Whose game should we be playing?
Hers.
Because
She's saying.
Happy
honey.
wife, happy life.
Amen. We can do that practically, but what if you're not talking about a wife? What if you're talking about somebody else from work? Whose word games?
The person that starts it, you listen to say what they're
Okay.
asking or how they start it.
Okay. Remember, I'm not trying to say you guys are wrong. What I'm trying to get at is you got to think of in terms of what people thought language was doing. Each word has one meaning. Each word has one concept, and it's plug and play. Now we're going to talk in a few minutes, we're going to talk about what does it mean when you move to a different culture with an entirely different language. It's going to blow this whole thing right out of the water. Because if you're having a conversation, don't I have the right to hear what makes sense to me? Don't I live in my world? Don't I have the right to say, this is the way I understand it? And you come into me and say, yeah, but I'm the one doing the talking. Yeah, but I'm the one doing the listening. What gives you the right to dictate the conversation? You're the speaker, but I'm the hearer. Don't I have the right to hear it in my own way?
And you ask questions, you don't.
This is what does happen. This is what we do. But we're talking about fundamentals. What is language really doing? Is it all about the sender or is it all about the receiver?
Neither.
Okay, then what is it? If it's neither, then what is language? What are we doing with it? And are we really even able to talk to anybody at all? Because I really don't know your word games that you're playing right now, do I? What is this doing to the concept of communication?
Totally destroys it, and it also means you arrive at, where the postmodernists do, that nobody can know anything.
About anything?
Yeah, and
Yes.
the fact that I asked you for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
And I gave you bologna and cheese, well, you just didn't talk in my language, right? But that's really how it goes in postmodernism, is it begins to break down this concept of communication. Now we're going to take one more jump. I got a video I want to share here. This will be about 5 minutes. It's actually a 14-minute video. I want to play the whole thing. Can't play the whole thing because we don't live in that world. But this is a female talking, a lady talking at TED Talks. Anyone know what TED Talks are? TED Talks are church for non-believers. It's where you go to get really good, cool, life-changing information, but you're getting it from a secular viewpoint. So if you want to go to church for non-believers, go to a TED Talk. We're going to change the world in this way. Ba-da! Never mind, how does last week's message have continuity with this week's message? Don't ask that question.
Well, no, because there is no continuity. You can't know.
All right, so what we're going to have here is Lyra Mordiski. She's going to be talking to us just for 5 minutes about the power of language. So you've gotten all of this, and none of this requires us to jump languages yet. We're not talking about Spanish and French. This is what's happening in English. So when she's done talking, I want us to have a conversation about this.
Continue using language because I can. This is one of these magical abilities that we humans have. We can transmit really complicated thoughts to one another. So what I'm doing right now is I'm making sounds with my mouth as I'm exhaling. I'm making tones and hisses and puffs, and those are creating air vibrations in the air. Those air vibrations are traveling to you. They're hitting your eardrums, and then your brain takes those vibrations from your eardrums and transforms them into thoughts. I hope that's happening. So, because of this ability, we humans are able to transmit our ideas across vast reaches of space and time. We're able to transmit knowledge across minds. I can put a bizarre new idea in your mind right now. I can say, imagine a jellyfish waltzing in a library while thinking about quantum mechanics. Okay. Now, if everything has gone relatively well in your life so far, you probably haven't had that thought before. But now I've just made you think it through language. Now, of course, there isn't just one language in the world. There are about 7,000 languages spoken around the world. And all the languages differ from one another in all kinds of ways. So some languages have different sounds, they have different vocabularies, and they also have different structures, very importantly, different structures. That begs the question, does the language we speak shape the way we think? Now, this is an ancient question. People have been speculating about this question for forever. Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor, said to have a second language is to have a second soul. Strong statement that language crafts reality. But on the other hand, Shakespeare has Juliet say, "What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Well, that suggests that maybe language doesn't craft reality. These arguments have gone back and forth for thousands of years. But until recently, there hasn't been any data to help us decide either way. Recently, in my lab and other labs around the world, we've started doing research, and now we have actual scientific data to weigh in on this question. So let me tell you about some of my favorite examples. I'll start with an example from an Aboriginal community in Australia that I had a chance to work with. These are the Kuptayar people. They live in Ponparau, at the very west edge of Cape York. And what's cool about Kuptayar is, in Kuptayar, they don't use words like left and right. And instead, everything is in cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And when I say everything, I really mean everything. You would say something like, oh, there's an ant on your southwest leg. Or move your cup to the north-northeast a little bit. In fact, the way that you say hello in Kuptayar is you say, which way are you going? And the answer should be north-northeast in the far distance. How about you? So imagine as you're walking around your day, every person you greet, you have to report your heading direction. That would actually get you oriented pretty fast, right? Because you literally couldn't get past hello if you didn't know which way you were going. In fact, people who speak languages like this stay oriented really, really well. They stay oriented better than we used to think humans could. We used to think that humans were worse than other creatures because some biological excuse, oh, we don't have magnets in our beaks or in our scales. No, if your language and your culture trains you to do it, actually, you can do it. There are humans around the world who stay oriented really well. And just to get us in agreement about how different this is from the way we do it, I want you all to close your eyes for a second and point southeast. Now keep your eyes closed, point. Okay, so you can open your eyes. I see you guys pointing there, 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 there. I don't know which way it is myself. You have not been a lot of help. So let's just say the accuracy in this room is not very high. This is a big difference in cognitive ability across languages, right? Where one group, very distinguished group like you guys, doesn't know which way is which, but in another group, I could ask a 5-year-old and they would know. Sure?
Okay, so what do we make of this? Just take some of the concepts and start building them out a little bit further, right? What do we do with this? What does this mean about, take Wittgenstein and talk about language and imprecision, and then talk about word games, and then make this jump? What does this mean?
I already knew I was directional change.
But what is she saying? She's saying that the way our language works actually orients the way our brain works. And if we were required in everyday conversation to figure out which way was north, south, east, and west, because everything was in that orientation, we would learn it. And so what does that mean about culture's impact upon us? What does that mean about language's impact upon us as people?
I think you gotta be careful.
I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying let's take this and make some implications from it. Okay? What do you think postmoderns drew out of this?
There's certainly a nurture impact to what we find as far as priorities. That society's priorities on that group of people.
Sure.
We're going to teach you this because this is a priority in our civilization. But it might be totally different than the Aborigines,
Yeah. Well, what if we ran into a culture that didn't have the word secular? Just didn't have it. It wasn't a word in their vocabulary. We came to them, we started talking to them, and we said, well, what do you do with people in your society who don't have anything to do with God? And they say, well, there's nobody in our society who has nothing to do with God. And they say, well, what do you do for things like eating and drinking and sleeping? Don't those have nothing to do with God? No, those have everything to do with the gods. Well, don't you have things that are secular? And we take the idea and we introduce it into their culture. And we tell them, these are things that we do in our everyday world that have nothing to do with God. What have we done to that person who's been enculturated in a language and in a culture? There's no conception of secular and sacred. What have we done?
We told them that they're wrong, that something's missing.
Told them they're wrong, there's something missing. Well, I can buy that from modernist perspective. What if we're saying we've introduced a new concept into their culture? And we've changed their culture. Because they don't have the ability, they don't have the words to think of a life without the gods. They don't have a word for it. So it's not even a conception. So what you guys can do here is try to think about the sermon this morning, but close your eyes and try not to do it in English. How do you think? Do we think in some independent language, or do we think in English? We think in English. The language impacts impacts the way that we're thinking, and it impacts the way we construct our world. So in other words, in a culture that doesn't have the language for secular and sacred, they don't have the concept of secularism. And you have to give it to them. And if you give it to them in language, it's not just you're not just giving them a word, you're giving them an entire packaged concept with it. That there's a whole package that goes with the word. What's that mean about English? And what's that mean about what we've been doing to the world? What have we been doing by broadcasting our English television all over the world?
Well, because we are a main trading power, now almost everybody speaks English.
Yes.
Across the world.
And what does it mean about other cultures and how we relate to them? We're the dominant language. We're the dominant culture. Our language is framing the conversation. And how you frame the conversation is incredibly, incredibly important. Postmodernism said, you are thinking culturally. Language is not just a tool for communication. It is cultural expression. You're learning not just language, you're learning a culture. And that culture is being absorbed into everything. And it's affecting everything that you do in ways that are so fundamental. We don't say, well, I hurt my right hand. We say, I hurt my northwest hand. And if I turn around now, I've hurt my southwest, right? My southwest hand hurt. Could you imagine trying to do that work as an interpreter into that context? How do you say to this culture, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing? You have to frame it differently. And this is what language is doing, is it says language is not just a byproduct of communication. The way moderns thought that language was plug and play. You just say, oh, there's a chair, right? All I got to do to get the idea across is take that word and turn it into Spanish, or turn it into French, or turn it into Creole, right? It has the same meaning in English as it does in Creole. Let me give you an illustration. We say the word chair, right? So let's pretend that you're in my office, or someone's going to come into my office. So we sit down here, and we're going to bring a chair out, right? All right, so who's going to come to my office and have a chat? Oh, we need someone to come in here. Sean, will you come into my office and have a chat?
Literally?
Literally, come over here. All right, so he's coming in to sit in my office to have a chat, right? Now, before he comes in, he sits down, and as he's coming in to sit down, right? He's coming into my office. Hey, Sean, I'm so glad you're here. Really appreciate you came to have a chat. Hey, have a seat.
Yeah.
That right there. Now, what are you thinking at this moment before we even started our conversation?
Somebody else is going to be here.
Why did he get that idea? It's just a chair. It's just an object. It's just sitting here. That's all I need you to do. Thanks. A chair is never just a chair. It has cultural significance. So I can't just take out the word chair and translate it, because what about other cultures? Do they use chairs the same way we do? Talking about the banana tree in English might not have a whole lot of meaning to us. Talking about the banana tree in South America, in agricultural societies, might have something to do with how you make a living. So what means one thing to us might not have any meaning at all to another culture, or what has incredible meaning to another culture might not have any meaning at all to us. So what does this do with things like Paul's hermeneutic in chapter 4 of Galatians? Now let's take this back to the very beginning, Paul, chapter 4 in Galatians. What does this mean?
I don't know, have you read the original ancient Greek?
Have you read the original ancient Greek? Well, actually the original was in Hebrew. And Paul...
In Galati, I got it.
Well, there was the Septuagint, which is what? What is the Septuagint?
Yeah, Greek translation.
It's the Greek translation. Was Paul reading the Greek translation or the Hebraic translation? Probably Paul was both. He probably understood both. But which one is he reading in mainly?
Septuagint.
Probably the Septuagint. Does that impact his interpretation of the text?
Well, he would understand the Hebrew, so you've got a
Now,
dual understanding.
he's got a dual understanding. Now, let's talk about allegorical meanings from texts. Who's right? Who's reading Galatians chapter 4 right? The modernists in 1790 who were saying Paul is butchering this whole thing. The author wrote thought in Hebrew, and these are the conceptions that he's thinking of in Hebrew. And we know this absolutely. What do? Who's confused? Okay, that's good. That's good. At least we kind of get the idea that this is complicated. We end up saying in postmodernism, everybody's reading is okay. And this is where you get to the idea that texts have no objective meaning. They only have relative cultural meaning. They don't mean anything in and of themselves. They only have meaning that the culture gives it. And if the culture loses the interest, well then it loses the interest. So what kind of meaning is there? Is there any objective meaning to anything?
No.
Nothing has objective meaning. And even the conversation that Sean and I have, Sean could have interpreted this, you guys could interpret this entire conversation in a completely different way. So, meanings are all for you to sort out for yourself. And this happens in Bible studies. What does this text mean to you? What are we doing? We're certainly not looking for the objective meaning anymore. Right? What are we doing? How many of us have been at Bible studies where they start talking about the Bible in this way? What does this text mean to you? What do you think they're doing? Are they doing a pre-modern, modern, or a postmodern hermeneutic? This is a postmodern hermeneutic. We're saying there is no real meaning. All there is meaning for you. And that's the only meaning that there is.
But that also means how someone can, with all sincerity, say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me.
Absolutely. That's how that's possible. That's how you can get to that. Is this isn't my truth. And we talk about it like this, right? Well, that's not my truth. 150 years ago, that would have been a crazy thing to say. Nobody walked around saying, well, that's just not my truth. They would say, what do you mean? Like you own it? Like it's yours? Well, with this, they'd say, yeah. And you have your truth, and you have your truth, and there is no universal truths. All there are is personal, individualized truths. Now, whether we like this or not, and this does create problems. And the church, believe it or not, have actually worked through some of these problems trying to figure it out. There's a lot of work. Okay, this is a lot of work. This is why hermeneutics is so fun, because it's not just a matter of how do we read a text, and was Paul really right doing that hermeneutic? How do we read any texts? Is there a right way to read texts at all? How do we do this? How do we... And it's not just, guys, this is not just a biblical issue. This is a historical issue. This is a literature issue. You can have people who will say, they'll have classes on lesbian and gay readings of Geoffrey Chaucer. What are they doing? What's a gay and lesbian reading of any text? How's that possible? Right? Well, you have to get rid of the idea that there's any objective meaning in Geoffrey Chaucer's work. So what you're asking is, how do gay people receive Chaucer's work? Whatever Chaucer meant when he wrote it, what is it to us? It's almost completely gone. Whatever he meant, it's just gone. As a matter of fact, they'll even go so far as to say, the moment it is written, it's no longer his. He has no right over that work any longer. It now belongs to the world, and the world gets to do with it what they will. He has no control over it at all. Now this sounds crazy to some of us who are moderns, right? This kind of sounds crazy. But this is why you go to universities and you get these crazy discussions. What are some thoughts on this before we get out of here? Because Pastor Emily's got a great message today. What do we think of this? How do we make sense of this?
Well, it collapses on the face of it, because I have yet to know of a postmodernist who goes home and doesn't believe what he hears on his answering machine. And so, by that very act, is admitting there is objectivity whether you like to admit it or not. And something is still true whether you like to believe it or not.
Well, how about there is some communication, whether we like it or not. We're just not sure how much.
That is providing
that provides some kind of meaning. How about that there is meaning, maybe not just personal meaning? This is tricky, guys. On your one end of the crazy,
it's objective.
Sure, well, kind of. It can be objective. It depends on what you mean by it. On the one end, you get the crazies. There is no meaning at all. Life is meaningless. You make it for yourself. That's kind of the very, very, very far extreme. And on the other end, you have your modernists who are like, no, It has meaning. Words have meaning, they have values, and we only have values in this context. And you can kind of have a place along the scale here in terms of how it works. How many have seen people on some kind of a scale like this? Or at least interacted with people on some kind of a scale like this? Does this make sense to you? Other thoughts on this? Yeah.
Your description of that spectrum, to me, I just think of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is like really hard to figure out because at times it says this is meaningless. This doesn't mean anything in life. And then at times it's like, but with that there's so much meaning behind it.
Yes.
It's like, which is it?
Right.
And I don't know, I just find that book really hard to understand at times.
It's a fascinating book. Ecclesiastes is great. Other thoughts on this? Yeah, Sean.
You know, it's easy, I think, for some of us to think, and we talk about this in marriage counseling as well, but if you just better define your words, you know, so that the words that you're saying are misinterpreted, so better define them. And something Stein would say that, well, you're using words to define words, and now you're in the same situation they were before.
Yes.
You know, that those words have ambiguity, and so you can define those words, and you define those words with.
Right.
But again, you're using words.
Yeah.
And so it is a tricky situation. There's something to that, you know, although I don't agree with that philosophy totally. There's something to it.
Absolutely. Now here's the thing, I'm not asking you guys to buy it. I'm just trying to help you understand it, so you can make sense of it. I'm not saying that words don't have any meaning, but I'm trying to help you understand why people run around saying words have no meaning. It's not some kind of random thing that just kind of plopped into the world. This comes from somewhere.
Which then, but again, it immediately defies itself. If you're running around saying words have no meaning, why bother doing it? Because your words have no meaning.
Sure.
And so
it goes to this whole idea, if you're going to try to be consistent with that idea all the way through. I think if we use this idea like salt on a meal, hey, remember, language is imprecise, language is what frames our world. I think it's helpful. Trying to build anything on this, I think is extremely difficult. I don't know how you build a culture on this idea. Very, very difficult. But it's fantastic at destroying things. Right? Do you see how this is fantastic? This is fantastic at destroying anything. It'll demolish anything, you just have a real hard time building it. It's like dynamite. Can you build a house out of dynamite? Yes. Should you build a house out of dynamite? Maybe not. Right? Might not be the best idea. Let's pray. Father, we're thankful for hermeneutics. We're thankful for what it does to us currently. That we live in this world where there is some ambiguity. We are not God. You are. You know all. We do not. We're thankful for that distinction. We love you and we praise you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Pastor has got a great message today. I wish we all got to hear it.
by the way, Genesis 21. Good morning, good to see you after all you've been through.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
I'm sure it is.
No, I think it's just 14, so I'll make sure we get the right thing here. I should be next week. Yeah, so I should be...
Sorry.
See you.
Back. And then...